The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Learning How to Learn by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Sanctified Greed. Sufi study is in some ways more difficult, in others easier, than other forms of study involving man's development of himself. It is more difficult, for instance, because many of the approaches and behavior patterns needed by Sufic study are not naturalized in ordinary culture. They have not been needed by societies in order to form and sustain themselves up to a certain point. It is easier, again, to approach many Sufi patterns because we already have the analogy of thought patterns and behavior instruction being passed down by the culture for establishing and maintaining itself. The principle is there. But sometimes the two are in conflict, or seem to be. For example, the undifferentiated desire for attention and frequent stimuli intakes in common denominator rhythm is known to everyone. In most human cultures, especially in the cruder forms, this stimulus intake has been harnessed to the culture's own service. It has not been analyzed and divided up as, for instance, you would divide, in the case of food, appetite from nutritional requirement and again from taste, flavor, habit, and greed. So, taking our example, people have sanctified greed, so long as it is the kind of greed prized by the society. All other kinds of greed are labeled bad, but acceptable greed is labeled good motivation only too often. This diversion of greed into national, tribal, and similar objectives only perpetuates addictive behavior. People develop a taste for, say, attention. The society says, yes, you may have it. All you have to do is seek our approval by works of charity, heroism, whatever the society in question thinks it wants or needs. Such approved works not infrequently cause injustice to others. Because the victim seeks and gets stimuli, he is generally fully occupied with this, and fails to see that he is being manipulated or that he has a compulsion. His spectrum of perception of the, in this case, acquisitive, is never developed. It is as if he had a sense of touch, but could not tell fine from rough or hot from cold. He is correspondingly at a disadvantage in respect to people who have a finer sense, and also in respect to his and his society's possible variety, including the solution of problems. As he has never been told that there is sensitive touch, to continue the analogy, he cannot perceive it. As he gets approval from using coarse touch, he is at the mercy of those people and institutions which lay down the rules. As he does not conceive the possibility of anything more sophisticated, he has no chance of finding it. Because it does not exist, of course, within the terms of his conventions, in his tribe. Or he may imagine the possibility, but be wrong in his choice of method of developing it. This is, of course, the pre-rational, pre-scientific, pre-organized state. It is referred to by Sufis as the all soup has lumps in it situation, after the tale of the yokel who wouldn't accept lumpless soup because he hadn't encountered it before and refused to eat it. So he is not only coarse, he is an addict. How can he be cured? He can be cured by experience, but first he must conceive the possibility. Next he must be exposed to it, but only after he has attained spare capacity, time and alignment which will allow him to focus on the problem. He can never do so while the only alternatives he is offered are simply other forms of addiction. He must get used to the idea that he is automatized even when he is gulping the panacea called, I am not going to be automatized. He may have to try again and again. Sa'di, in his Bostan, the orchard, says, "Not every oyster holds a pearl. Not every time does the archer hit the target." Psychic idiots. Question. Is there any quick, rule-of-thumb way of telling whether a person is serious and capable of learning in the Sufi way? Answer. If there is any, it is this. Serious people are prepared to start at the beginning and go a step at a time, to start the journey of 1,000 miles with one single step. People who are not serious are looking for miracles and stimuli and advanced work. Question. What produces and what sustains this unsuitability? Answer. Vanity, which is why most systems require humility. Question. If most systems require this, why does it not work? Answer. Because most systems end up by making imagined humility into a form of vanity, so they end up with vanity just the same. You can perceive a person's aspiration if it is genuine, because this creates a change in the emanations from such a person. Useless prayer. Omar Khayyam said, "They went, and none returned again, to tell you the telling of that beyond. You won't gain anything through automatic prayer. Prayer is worthless without sincerity and true aspiration." This second question about unsuitability interests me rather more than the first about quick rule-of-thumb methods. Has the inquirer ever asked himself what he could do with such a method? Question. But surely prayer, properly carried out, can prepare for proper learning? Answer. Properly learned is the operative phrase. People who pray and who do not attend to the necessary change in themselves as its basis are not the same as those who really do pray. People who pray have to be altered by prayer, and this alteration is partly manifested in their behavior and temperament. Many Sufi teachers have insisted that disciples observe psychological and social development before even allowing them to pray, or at least before acknowledging that they are capable of effective prayer. Khwaja Muinuddin Gharib Nawaz Chishti actually equates prayer with right thought and right action on the ordinary human level. Prayer consists, he said, in hearing the complaints of the aggrieved and to assist them, to help the needy and the oppressed, to feed the people and to set free the captives from captivity. All these things, Gharib Nawaz emphasized, are of great importance. When criticism can stop. Question. When do people stop criticizing what others are doing? Answer. When Jalaluddin Rumi started to recite his couplets of wisdom, it is reported, people had not had enough time to form any opinion of him. Some were interested, some were not. Others, following an inevitable human pattern, resented him. They said, "We hope that you do not think that you are a second Aesop or something." Western Sage. According to one sage of the West, criticism has to go through these stages. 1. It is impossible. 2. It is possible, but it is useless. 3. It is useful, but I knew about it all the time. Criticism can then stop. The sick man who cursed. Enduring the criticism of others may be part of doing good to them. You can read in the Bostan of Sa'di the story of the sick man whom the great Sufi Maruf of Kark was helping. He cursed Maruf, whose wife asked him why he continued to serve one who was so ungrateful. Maruf answered that this patience was part of the help for the sick. The patient, he had observed, could not find rest until he had been allowed to vent his wrath. I am not myself much interested in the stopping of criticism. How about interesting oneself in improving the quality of criticism so that it can be more useful? Much of it is so bad that even undesirable things criticized are not effectively criticized, especially when the critic shows his spleen or bias instead of being constructive. Sheikh Abdullah Ansari of Herat, the great Sufi teacher, has rightly said, "The evil of another person can be averted. There is no escape from one's own." Information and experience. Question: why do you stress the importance of information as well as of experience? Answer: there is a saying that, according to what a person's mentality is, even an angel may seem to him to have a devil's face. It is also useful to note that whereas an angel may seem to have a devil's face, and a devil an angel's face, there are other forms of this complaint. Information before opinion. People tend to form opinions about people, things, and ideas only on the basis of the information and prejudice which they already have. If you show, say, a camera to a child or a primitive man, he might think that it was a monster. What people need is information, more often than they realize. This is the reason why generations of Sufis have labored to broaden the basis of information and experience available to man. With information and experience, man may make more reliable judgments about people, ideas, and things. The less information he has, the less likely he is to be able to understand. To try to teach anyone who is in a condition of insufficient information is futile, never attempted by real teachers, and wasteful of time and energy to both parties. Institution without insight. Halls and colleges and learned discourses and porch and arch, says Hafiz, what advantage are they when the wise heart and seeing eye are absent? And to make real sense of experience, information must be there as well. The teaching is a matter of conduct. Question: can people pursue a form of study in Sufism without being trained and constantly stimulated, as they are in all systems which I have examined? Answer: this famous saying from our tradition repays the closest possible attention. The teaching is a matter of conduct. By acting in a certain manner, a person may be able to give the impression that he is enlightened, studious, worthwhile, valuable, or many other impressive things. All teachings, in their lower ranges, seek to teach people to adopt acceptable conduct and behavior. Conduct here does not mean conformism. Because of this emphasis upon conduct, misunderstandings arise very easily. People come to imagine that if they seem to be conforming, they are acceptable, or that they are progressing. The fact is, of course, that conformism is a part of the civilizing of people. If they conform to the rules of the culture which surrounds them, larger numbers of people can associate together more easily. Strife is generally reduced. Communication between people becomes possible when, for instance, they are not all talking at once. It may be necessary to conform to certain kinds of expected behavior in order to learn something. But when this conformism becomes the only or major characteristic of the people, the teaching has stopped taking effect. Instead of learning, we have practice of conformism. Conformism has two possible evils. One, that people will mistake it for higher behavior, and two, that people will believe that all they have to do is to appear to conform, and that, as a consequence, they will get a place in heaven. We are all familiar with human systems in which either or both of these deteriorations are evident. They are so persistent, indeed, that conformism may be taken as the outward mark of organization. But not only need this not be so, it may be positively dangerous to the potential function of the group. Then why do we say the teaching is a matter of conduct? Knowledge and action are related. First, because when a form of conduct is laid down in the teaching, whether it be doing a task or carrying out a study or exercise, the relationship between mental set and bodily action is specific. It helps the exercise or undertaking to operate correctly. Secondly, because when a person is given something to do as an assigned or expected activity, how he does it, whether he does it at all, the degree of competence or activity without constant exhortation, all of these are diagnostic. One can tell, and the individual himself should be able to tell by self-examination, whether he is progressing or whether he is behaving in an automatic manner. If he finds that he needs constant stimulus of threat or promise, he is not attuning himself in the right manner. If he will conduct himself in a certain manner only providing that he receives a certain amount of attention, he is placing the demand for attention before the study. The many different outward forms which the teaching has assumed through the generations has had two main reasons behind it. First, that according to the time and culture involved, the teaching must be projected afresh. Second, and more to our point at this moment, the new forms are adopted partly in order to prevent automatic conformism. In a real teaching situation, the individual is tested and can test himself against the degree of activity, leading to personal volition, which he is able to maintain without indoctrination, repetition, constant appeals. In order to show that they are not trained and constantly stimulated, as you call it, and to show that conduct is of inner as well as outer significance, Sufis have adopted the malamati, or blameworthy, method of behavior. A Sufi may deliberately court opprobrium, not for masochistic or attention-arousing purposes, but in order to show others how readily they will respond to outward signals which may have no meaning at all. Similarly, some people working in the dervish path have been called beshara, or without law, because they have chosen down the centuries to practice their training privately and to avoid public stimuli, to indicate that appearances can mean only superficiality. Tale of the Fly. Sadi reports one quite characteristic example of conduct teaching from the life of Hatim al-Assam, the deaf. Some didacticians, he says, hold that Hatim of Balkh was deaf. Do not believe it. One day he saw a fly caught in a web and spoke to it, for the edification of those present, saying that it had been deceived by something attractive and desirable, but had only managed to get itself caught. But this analogy of the human condition was further given point by the audience when they realized that Hatim's attention had been attracted to the buzzing of the fly, which other people could hardly hear, and yet it was he who was supposed to be deaf. Hatim explained that he was not deaf at all. He pretended that he could not hear because then he would not be expected to listen to praise or opposition intended to influence him. If people thought him deaf, those who surrounded him would say what they really thought about him. An interesting difference between Sufis and others is that, like sociologists and other scientists carrying out tests, Sufis are able to pretend, to deceive, as some will always have it, while the convention is that people should never pretend to be what they are not, in this case, of course, to be deaf. But the Sufi always points out that while he may pretend to a purpose, to point out a fact, the ordinary person will pretend because he wants people to accept and respect him. His pretense, therefore, is far worse and far less productive, except of deception and self-deception. The study course laid down by the teacher for his student in Sufism may have degenerated into conformism and automatism in various imitative communities and supposed schools, but they are easy to identify. The guidance which the teacher gives, no matter what form it takes and how it may conflict with other people's assumptions of what it is or should be, is the method of learning from a Sufi. The teacher's role is to render himself superfluous to the learner by helping him to escape from the toils of lesser ideas and of the shallow mind. Until that moment comes, like a guide to a path which is invisible to the learner, the teacher is followed with absolute trust. The great Sufi Abdul Qadir of Gilan stresses in the 17th address of his Futu al-Ghaib that this is like the role of the wet nurse, who has to cease suckling the infant when it is able to eat solid food. When secondary and low-level attachments have vanished, the seeker goes into a relationship with objective reality. At this point, continues the Sheikh, there is no further need of the disciple relationship. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.